Renewable cities, essentially, we're trying to make cities better. Our focus right now is BC, but we've had focus more broadly as previously. Currently, we have 4 projects focused on housing, transportation, and construction. And how it relates is, one of our projects is specifically looking at mobility and looking how we can reduce the need for driving. So looking at active transportation, transit, and another project looking at housing on the North Shore, specifically looking at older homeowners and how we can help enable them to use their homes in more flexible ways. And so, I think that relates quite well to community. It builds relations with, between homeowners and tenants. Opens up options.
Yesterday was my son's 16th birthday. He's going to get his L license, and in Canada, that's a real rite of passage, right? It's and why do we go down that step? Because there's a lot of benefits to having a car, and there are a lot of things that we love about our cars. Like, why do we love them? I had a Saab back when I was younger, and I loved to sing in my car. Right now, I get a huge benefit from spending one-on-one time with my kids. I get to pack in a lot more into the day sometimes. I use lots of other modes of transportation as well, but there are huge benefits to having my car, and I think that's, often we think about this as a technical challenge, like how are we going to redesign our roads? How are we going to switch to EVs? How are we going to switch modes? Is there enough car sharing? These are all technical questions, but at its heart, this is also a hugely cultural question where, for many of us, it's, it can be prestige, the type of car that we have. These are not things that get solved overnight, but what we need to realize is that a lot of our car-oriented culture is also hugely frustrating, and clearly it's got pain points, like its massive impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and gridlock, keeping our pets and our kids safe, equity questions like who gets to move around, who gets gridlocked, why, and why are a lot of our communities, so much asphalt and not necessarily spaces that we enjoy being in. So I think what I wanted to bring into this conversation from the lens of One Earth Living is really thinking about moving with the local area plan conversations more from a conversation about the pieces, about those pieces that we need to bring in, into a conversation about the system. Like, what are we trying to achieve here? And at One Earth Living, we really talk about that difference between access versus mobility. So mobility is like, okay, what's the goal of mobility? It's like, is our goal moving around? No, our goal is not moving around. Our goal is actually access to the kind of things, kind of community that we want to live in. And so when we switch the question to a question of like, what are we trying to access? What are we trying to build? We get a far richer conversation that moves away from car dependency into other things. And is this future far away? Like, not necessarily. There were some kids downtown, and they were asked to take part in a walk to school challenge. And they said, but I always walk to school. Like, sorry, what is this challenge exactly? And in Japan, there's been a huge downspike in terms of the number of kids that want a driver's license. There is no point to having a driver's license. They need to be able to get around. They've got what they need in their community. They know how to get there, and they get there quickly. So the car culture in particular, and what we're all sort of sitting here, when I looked at the thought exchange, I'm like, oh yeah, so many of us are on that same page about really wondering how can we transform these communities. But the car culture was really sold to us. It wasn't something that was inevitable, because it has all those pain points, bad backs, gridlock, etc. The Sunday drive was manufactured. It wasn't something that appeared to start with. So now back to your original question, and I had asked David for a little bit of flexibility to just give that framing that we take as One Earth. As an organization, we're really interested in that systems level. So we do look at the pieces where actually we advise city governments and others in terms of how to actualize on those pieces, but we're interested in like how do you actually move and when do you do that? So Charles, you mentioned the question of seniors living in their homes. So one of our big leverage points is around life moments, and so we have a lot of work happening around that really sort of intersects with that. The system as a whole and how does that shift? And then, you know, that question of what is the goal of the system. So I ask you to kind of bear that in mind as you have your conversations. Are we talking about mobility or access to a better life, access to well-being?
When people think TransLink, they think bus, SkyTrain, West Coast Express, C-Bus, and of course that's really important to what we do. But what a lot of people don't know is we are North America's first integrated multimodal transportation authority, which means we glue all the modes together. And I think that's really important. I think that's going to be an important theme for us tonight. I just want to do a little bit of a quick poll or survey. By show of hands, in the last week, how many people here have taken transit of some form? Okay. How many people have driven as the driver? Passenger in a vehicle? Walk, bike, or roll? Ride-hailing, ride-hailing or taxi? Okay, anything else? How many people put up their hand more than one time? Yeah, so I think this just goes to show you just how multimodal we are, and that's the thinking that TransLink is putting forward when we're building our plans. So again, going back to the transit equation, we're coming out of the pandemic, and we're recovering our ridership. We're currently at 90% ridership recovery, leading our peers in North America, and that's something that we're really proud of. We want, like, senior government has really been an important part of that, and as well our focus on customers, which has been, really key to our success. Some of the things as I mentioned, back to the multimodal perspective, we plan, manage, and fund major roads, bridges, cycling, new mobility, and so we do a lot that a lot of people don't think that we are responsible for. Part of that, we're investing $130 million a year in roads, bridges, and cycling. And just to the North Shore alone last year, we invested $5 million. So this is the kind of, we think about building a region and building cities through transportation. And so that's kind of what we bring to the table here. We've got a lot going on. TransLink's a big organization. Right now we're trying to implement Transport 2050. We've got our Access for Everyone plan, which is our 10-year priorities. And it's going to be, as mentioned, a recurring theme tonight because it's less about thinking about moving people and steel and rubber as much as connecting people to opportunity for the things that they need in their daily life. So I'm sure we'll get into a lot of this, but I think that that's a good start. So
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Keane, and thank you, panelists. So now that you've seen their faces, I'm going to let them either stand or sit when they're answering the questions. If you want to see them better, there's some more seats up here, so feel free to move around. So I'm going to ask the questions in different orders just to keep it mixed up a little bit. And I think, given what you just talked about, Keane, something that's relevant to us here in West Van, what can residents of West Van and the North Shore in general look forward to in terms of improved transportation infrastructure over the next 10 years, to whatever extent you feel comfortable responding to that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I mentioned Access for Everyone. Our Access for Everyone plan is here. I don't know if anyone else got caught up in the atmospheric river yesterday, but I did, and this thing's a little bit waterlogged still. So, but this is our North Star and what we're shooting for the next decade. And really what that means is doubling in 10 years local bus service. It's about 170 kilometers of new rapid transit in the region, SkyTrain extension to UBC, Burnaby Mountain Gondola, and then sort of a new tack in terms of building bus rapid transit. And that's a new form of rapid transit for the region. And what that's meant to do is get people to where they need to go free from congestion. Right now, the plan is there's 9 corridors we're looking at. In terms of the North Shore, we're looking at a route that runs from Park Royal through City of North Vancouver, District, Burnaby, and Vancouver, as well as a rapid bus route, which is sort of like BRT light. That would go from Park Royal over the Lionsgate Bridge down through Vancouver. That's on the transit side. We're a regional agency and we're trying to create these regional connections. As I mentioned, we are also funding and investing in multimodal paths, bike infrastructure, bike walking and rolling. So those are things we're trying to complete as well. 450 kilometers of the major bikeway network. That's a traffic separated bikeway throughout the region and networks in every single urban core. So we're looking for willing municipal partners to make that happen, and really it is all about access for everyone, which is the theme of our 10-year plan.
Great. And thanks for that, Keane. And I mean, it must be interesting looking at some of these things, because I think I just heard today that there's one municipality that passed a bylaw that they can't provide any more bike lanes that are separated. They can still have some that are green and things like that. So, you know, it must be really interesting. I'm curious what kind of input you get when you're deciding what kind of infrastructure to put in place or how to approach it.
So we're a regional agency. We take a partnership approach. This is a federation of 23 members of Metro Vancouver, and we don't do anything without local partnership, right? And that includes with local councils and constituents. When we're thinking about bike infrastructure, we really want to build top quality, because we know survey after survey tells us, yeah, we live in a rainy environment and rain might suppress people walking, biking, and rolling, but really what people want is they want a safe place where they can walk, bike, and roll. And when I'm talking about rolling, I'm talking about wheelchairs as well. I'm talking about new forms of electric micromobility. The number one thing that we can do is invest in traffic separated paths so that people can do that safely and comfortably, all ages and ability. And so that's the kind of thing that we're trying to fund. Connect those destinations, those places that you need to go to.
That's great. Thank you very much, Keane. Charles, I think I'll put you on the spot next.
Yeah.
And these are topics that seem to be intermingled, and I'm not asking you to be an expert on all of them, but from your perspective, what's the connection in your mind to transportation and housing? Because they quite often end up in the same conversations.
Yeah, and Keane, feel free to add on to it. But yeah, people say the best transportation plan is a good land use plan. And so, when you have a lot of people located in close together or along, in linear configurations, it's just easier to provide transit. And rather than having everyone spread out. And I think one thing that's often overlooked or not kind of fully appreciated is how much value there is in real estate, and how the potential for that to fund transit or other active transport, other uses.
Sorry, expand upon that just a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So, in the region, it's become commonplace to have density bonuses where we provide additional density, additional height or units to developments, and in exchange, they provide either funds to the municipality, or they provide certain benefits like community centers, like libraries, like open space, and there's been conversations, but there's a potential, I think, for that to be applied to transit as well. Richmond, for Capstone Station, they charged units within a certain area, a certain amount per approved unit, and that was used to fund the station. And so, so I think if housing relates to transit in terms of providing riders, but also I think there's a potential for providing funding. Yeah.
And I see that there's changes afoot around some of those things. I saw a clip of Ken Sim, Vancouver's mayor, talking to, I think it was at Burnaby or something like that, around how they oriented, might not be Burnaby, but how they oriented a lot of their higher density housing around transportation, and wanted to see if there is one that they could embrace that in Vancouver a little bit more. So it's interesting. Attitudes are shifting, economic conditions are shifting that cause those conversations to be a little bit more important.
Yeah.
Dagmar, okay. What's the connection between mobility, the ability to get around, and community? And maybe if you could even say a little bit about, when you say community, what do you mean by that? Because I find a lot of people talk about community as it's a geography. But to me, that geography doesn't make a community. So if you could speak to that, that would be appreciated.
Yeah, thanks, David. Couple of things come to mind. So, first of all, I think when we're speaking about community, we're speaking about what builds those connections between us, what keeps our local community thriving, so keeps local business owners in place, keeps ourselves with access to the kind of services that we would like in our community in place. So I think that that's part of it. And so one way in which transportation sort of links to that is that sometimes other modes of transportation are slower modes of transportation. We are able to say hi to people when we're on a bicycle. We stop at the stoplights. We're not kind of like encompassed in our little metal bin. We're able to actually make those connections. Another way in which, like something else that comes to mind for me in terms of the connection with community is again that cultural piece that I'm talking about. So how do we make this just a part of being in community, that we take different modes of transport and that we don't use up parking spaces and create places where that is, you know, one of our more dominant land uses. So an example of that would be the university passes, the school passes that are given out to our university system here are hugely influential in terms of having people step for the first time on a bus and making that the norm, making that the way to get around, really orienting people to how that actually happens. It's been shown that those are impactful, and I can see it in my daughter's own life where she takes the bus to school every day, but it means that she also uses that monthly pass to go down to Lonsdale Quay and to do this and to do that. It gives her an enormous amount of independence and supports the stores like Salvation Army instead of the mall. So yeah, those are just a few thoughts that come to mind for me.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so and as you're going through these, you might want to be thinking about some questions that you might want to pose these folks. But let's go to Charles.
Yeah.
So what's the consensus amongst if there is a consensus amongst town planners regarding density? Like, do we have that in the Vancouver area? See any coalescence or people parting ways on that?
Yeah, I think among town planners, it's almost become dogma that density is good. That, you know, the more people you have in an area, the easier it is to support local businesses. You know, it's easier to, you know, have social connections, to meet people on the street. You have more people in these public spaces looking out for each other, providing informal security. You know, services become a lot easier to provide. You know, you don't have to run as many meters of pipes, of wires. But, you know, it's, you know, there's this consensus, but I think it's really context dependent. The right amount of density really depends on where you're, what you're talking about, where you're talking about. You know, there are also a lot of other factors involved. You know, in BC, in the Lower Mainland, you have, you know, the province being involved with housing and with healthcare and education. You have municipalities involved with parks, with libraries, community centers. There's so much that goes into a community, and if, you know, one element is missing, it's really hard to provide that density. And so, you know, not exactly answering the question, but, you know, one thing that's really important is having all these people who are involved in some way on board and in agreement on the direction forward, and not having you know, one jurisdiction trying to do something, but, you know, another authority, you know, doing something else. There's really a need for dialogue and consensus on multiple levels. Yeah.
And you know, I was curious when you said the right amount of density, because it seems there's another factor there as well, which is the amount of density that the citizens are willing to absorb or support and things like that, in spite of all the good reasons for it, which makes it's not like it's a straight line, here's what we have to do. Dagmar, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll just add to say that, you know, I think part of the challenge with density is that we've traditionally separated out our business, our retail, and our residential areas. And so densifying without actually looking at building complete communities or more complete communities takes away that kind of human scale that we look for. And so that's something that needs to be addressed as we do that. And the other piece of that is that when you look at cities that do that really well, like Paris, for example, there's an enormous amount of public luxury. And so that's a term that I love, because it really looks at that maybe our individual homes or our individual assets need to be smaller, but they're connected in a walkable way or in a really easy to get way, biking or whatever, to enormous public luxury. And so density, when done right, can be incredibly helpful. But if you've got just this center and then everything is leading to congestion and more gridlock, then you've got problems.
Problem. Keane, you want to comment as well, please?
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't be having a proper conversation in Metro Vancouver unless we're talking about real estate, so let's go. That aside, I just want to add, I think, there's a big push right now for something called the missing middle. I don't know if you've heard of this concept, but one of our typical development patterns is sort of like the more familiar single-family homes, single-family zoning, and then putting growth in very, like, town centers, very tall. You think of Metro Town, that sort of thing. And I think what planners are realizing that we need like a more granular view of this, right? So you're thinking about the evolution of a person as they go through their lifestyle and, they change and their family needs change. Talking about adding laneway homes or secondary suites, duplexes, triplexes, low-rise apartments, 4 and 6 stories. That's my favorite urban form, is that kind of 4-story magic sweet spot when you think of like, where do you like to visit when you go on vacation? I like to go to Europe and, Seville, Paris, has that je ne sais quoi, that, your coffee shop is next door, your pharmacy is right there, your grocery store. And so, I think that there's a lot of benefits in terms of social interactions and social connectivity when you can see people. They say it makes something like 150 or 200 contacts before you make a friend. So if we can kind of think about our public realm and how to facilitate that, I think, there's a lot of challenges like social isolation, mental illness, and the more that we can do to facilitate that sense of community through our built environment, and that's land use, but also the transportation, that's the artery of our cities. So,
I think if you were going to design a new city today, knowing what we know, knowing what the circumstances are, it wouldn't look anything like what we have now. And one of the challenges is how you take this into something that's quite different in a way that's actually acceptable and manageable. Okay, Dagmar, I'm going to come to you for the next question then. So why should we prioritize sustainable transportation? And how can we build it into daily life? And if you have any examples, and also maybe when you say sustainable, or when we say sustainable, what's meant by sustainable transportation?
Yeah, great, thanks. So I think we've actually touched on a number of those pieces. I think at its heart, sustainable transportation is non-fossil fuel transportation as an individual. So that's, being multimodal as much as we can. That doesn't mean getting rid of the personal car. I think it's always so important to realize, we live in the system that we're in right now, but not to get stuck in that system and to really think forward to where we want to be. And I think Ambleside has, obviously one of the conversations today is about the local area plan and how we can build towards it. I think the seeds are there for the future in Ambleside, and so really looking at how to continue to build out those different modes of transportation for those who are there, and capitalize on these moments in our life where we can start making different choices. So how do we socialize people at a young age to be doing things differently? How do we support at a much bigger scale people who are working and needing to get to and from with really reliable options? And I think we do a pretty good, we do a good job here of understanding what it requires in the region, but now it's really pushing that past the personal car ownership moment into what we need in 5 or 10 years that is far less personal car reliant. Yeah.
And one of the things that occurs to me, you talk about really focused on the youth. A lot of these sessions, if we're talking demographically, there's not a lot of examples of the middle here or the youth, right? And so you folks are obviously interested enough to come here. I think one of the challenges is how to have them have a voice and actually have more sway.
Yeah,
what's
and also socializing within our communities, right? So when we think about sustainable transportation, some of these things are things that for certain communities are also not interesting to them, or they've never had an experience of doing that. So in Minnesota, they brought on 150 of the folks who are community leaders in the community and gave them orange bikes for the share bike system. And those people were seen biking around town and showing up at their meetings on these shared bikes. And it normalized something that wasn't really done in that community. And I would say the same for different age groups, right? We can think about seniors, we can think about youth. How do you normalize that? And that's a cultural conversation as much as it is, and then you develop the programs based on the cultural touch points.
I was just thinking that my daughter couldn't wait to move out of West Van. She just didn't like the vibe and the wealth and things like that. She said, "Oh, my friends, their parents, when they graduate, they gave them cars." I think, okay, well, first of all, we're not in that category. But it also perpetuates that. Like the car is the symbol of, you've got it. And those are tough to let go of. Keane, what will happen if nothing changes? What's the consequence of that elusive and much protected and defended status quo?
Well, I think, I would ask the people who know best, and that's you, and the people in the region, and what they say in public polling is the number one issue is housing affordability. And then it's social issues, homelessness, and then it's transportation, transit, congestion, infrastructure. And so those are kind of three major challenges, and to add on that, the climate crisis as well, right? So if we don't do anything, these problems are going to get worse, right? And so that's why we need to think smart, long-term, and be clear about our vision and make hard trade-offs to get there. And so, that's really rethinking how we build cities, how we create transportation. It's moving to zero emissions as rapidly as we can. It's building more forms of housing supply. And there's a number of determinants as to why housing is unaffordable, but one of them is supply, and we need to do more. And so that's talking to Charles's point, clustering housing around these heavy-duty rapid transit stops, right? If we're forcing people to buy a car, we're not giving them a choice, right? And that's where access for everyone comes in. If you're middle-aged, you have ability, middle income, you might have a car and you've got good access. But what about seniors or people with disabilities or young people? Do we really want to create that system? So let's think about all the other options, multiple forms of really good, rapid, frequent, high-quality transit, walking, biking, rolling, emerging technologies like autonomous vehicles and those sorts of things. We've got to pull every lever we can. And the good thing is, some of the solutions, they work for all of the above. Affordability, economy, climate, housing, it all comes together.
And I think one of the challenges that we have to do, it's probably a bad example, but the problem with selling life insurance to university students, it's so far beyond what they're thinking about. And I think some of the changes that you've talked about, it's very, we need to bring the future more into the present, to be thinking about it now. And so, so it goes up 1.5 degrees or 3 degrees, whatever. Not going to bother me. It's probably not my family, but so making it more. It's that balance between things that are important and urgent, and this is really important, and it's getting urgent. But now is the time to be acting on these things, right? In spite of the discomfort it may cause. And I think one of the greatest impediments to any kind of change is a personal value that says comfort. I have to have my comfort. Change doesn't have to be painful, but it's rarely comfortable. And how do we get to deal with that, both politically, environmentally, as citizens? Okay, let's see. Charles, how can you reimagine cities and to use planning to achieve these goals that we've been talking about? Any thoughts on that? How can they do it differently?
I know, no place is perfect, but I think a really good example to look to is Singapore. I recognize, it's a very different context, very different, politics, but I think they're a real example, a model of how a city could be built. So a lot of the land is owned by the government, is public, and they develop a lot of public housing to the point where I think about 70 some or 80 some percent of people live in public housing, and I think 80 some percent of people own their place through a freehold or leasehold. And new couples, young people, they can afford a place with just a quarter of their income. There's practically no homelessness there. You can get around easily by transit. There's abundant metro, light rail, buses. And it's a pretty green city too. There's tons of parks. So I guess to reimagine cities, I think would be a city where there is housing affordability, there is sustainable transit, there's plenty of jobs, everything is easily accessible, and the environment is taken care of. So I think that's how I reimagine a city. Yeah.
Great. So let's go there.
Yeah.
I recently read a term, I think it was compact cities. Are you familiar with that term?
Yeah.
So what is a compact city, and is it something that you have to create from scratch, or how do you become one? But first of all, let's understand what it is.
Yeah, I think that relates a lot to what we've talked about. Compact city is a city where you have a mix of uses. Everything is close together. You can walk to the grocery store, walk to school, walk to work, or a bike ride or a bus ride. And having everything on less land means there's more land around for farming, for forests, for other species to live. There's a lot of environmental benefits. You aren't taking as much, you don't use as much fuel to get around, not as much emissions. By having homes closer together with shared walls, you have less heating needs. It's easier to meet people, and so I think that's essentially the similar to the density argument. The compact city is liked by many people for these reasons.
And I wonder maybe if sometimes it's easier to think of a compact community as opposed to a whole city, but the same principles would apply, presumably.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would either of you care to comment on that before I?
On what is a compact city?
Well, sure. Let's go with that.
Sure. Why don't you
As it
comment?
relates
I
to
think
transportation.
Charles nailed it for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think I can probably just point to something where we often think like wouldn't it be ideal if we could just, to your point, sometimes start again, start afresh. But that's not where we're at. But I think around the world we can look at examples of places that have actually taken the neighborhoods that they have, the communities that they have, and transformed it in a lot less time than you would think, right? Like the city planner, director of city planning for the city of Vancouver, Sadie Johnson, said, it's remarkable that we always way overestimate what we can do in a year, but we underestimate what can be achieved in 5. Right? So in 5 years, you can have immense transformation. One of the projects that I lead on is called One Planet Saanich, and it works within the Capital Region District. And one of the stakeholders is called the Oakland Rise Wonerf. And they've taken inspiration from the thousands of what are called woonerfs in the Netherlands, where you really look at how to create this complete community, this neighborhood that is much more oriented around connecting people and sort of reorients the road space for people.
And how that can actually be a really powerful seed for transforming a neighborhood into one where there is increased connection. So just a last point on that complete community, that we often think about the pushbacks or the obstacles that are there, but there's also immense positive pull that comes towards those when we start to think about what we gain, whether it's health and well-being for ourselves by biking more, walking more, connecting to each other, getting away from social isolation, boosting the local economy. The pushback might be cultural or might be sort of like, can we even get there? But then the pulls are equally positive and very possible within a period of time.
Thank you. Now, Keane, I'm going to put you on. Oh, you want to comment? Then I'll put you on the spot.
I was just going to, kind of the idea that's in the air of like
what is a utopian city? How would we start from scratch? Like, what would it look like? I'm not, a little bit of pushback from me. I'm not so sure that I'm comfortable on that concept, because when I think of that, I think of these sort of like very large, very new planned cities in like Dubai or these other places that have sort of been emerging over the last 20 or 30 years. And I think like, when I think about the kind of community that I want to live, work, and play in, I think of there's history there, right? You've got like brick buildings, you've got heritage, you've got overgrown bushes and cracks in the sidewalk. And so I think when we're thinking about like, what is the ideal, it's like, you know, it's how do we integrate these concepts, like bringing in the new, mixing with the old in the context of the character. And so I think that, you know, that cultural and aesthetic, it's really critical. And there's actually, we can learn a lot from the past, right? When you think about how cities were 100 years ago before, you know, places were putting freeways to their downtown cores. Again, back to the Europe, you know, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker are next to you, and you know, you're relying a lot more on human-powered transportation. But anyway, that's just my opinion.
And by the way,
Yeah.
I suggested to the panelists that they indeed agree on everything each other said, that they have different opinions. We need to hear those as well. So, good example of that, Keane. So, not just the boat, let me get through these presentations. Cypress Village, they're trying to do that and keep it contained as much as, or so people don't have to travel as much. Keane, how far is TransLink and government committed to reducing car dependency, and what would the evidence of that be?
So we, 3 years ago, we adopted a new 30-year strategy called Transport 2050 that sets the direction. We did that in lockstep with every municipality. It's our largest ever public engagement. We had 150,000 conversations, 30,000 survey results. We worked with the province, we worked with Indigenous nations. We built this strategy, and the number one target in there is to reduce our reliance on the automobile by shifting people to more sustainable modes. By 2050, we want 50% of trips to be made by walking, biking, rolling, and transit, which would imply 50% or less by the automobile. We're currently, right now, about 55% of trips are driving alone, and 16 or 17% are passenger trips. So our sustainable mode share is about 27 or 28%. That is our metric of success and what the region is working towards.
Okay, and what's the trend? Like over the last few years, have you seen anything, you know, hockey stick up, or is it just slow progress?
I'd say overall, there's been slow progress to building sustainable mode share. The pandemic, of course, has thrown a spanner into the works, right? We actually don't know what mobility looks like right now. We have something on the field right now called the Trip Diary. It's basically the transportation census for Metro Vancouver. We do it every 4 or 5 years. I forget exactly, but it allows us to really get a grip on how people are traveling. And so that's going on right now. It's slow progress, but we are getting there. I mean, you need to be an optimist, of course. It takes large scale change, right? Building better transit, walking, biking, rolling, building these complete communities. And so that's where we're going, and we just really need to accelerate the things that are working.
And letting people know that, so they have a sense of momentum and change, right? Because they may not see it, but once they know it's there, let's get on board. Dagmar, and maybe it's just tying into this, why encourage less car usage? And you know, there may be a variety of different, it depends, questions to that, you know, or answers to that. And also if you have any examples you can speak to from other places that you're aware of or have been to. What are the advantages? Why bother?
Yeah, so I think you know, we've touched on a lot of this already, but perhaps I'll say that, of course, overarchingly, this is a question of ecological footprint and carbon reductions that are necessary. But on the plus side, it also leads to a better life, right? It leads to better communities. It leads to a better life. So those, to me, are the fundamental reasons why, is that this is actually leading us in a direction that's good from many perspectives. Yeah, I shared a number of different examples from around the world. Maybe I'll just take this question a little more locally, and then I would totally lean on both of you for a bit more nuance around it. But I think that part of what we need to be embracing in this period of transition towards more multimodal And where we absolutely need to get to with this 2050 plan is embracing experimentation, right? Like I don't know if everyone's seen the Lime bikes that are around in North Vancouver. Okay, these things don't happen overnight, and they're not always a success in the immediate. I've heard good stories, I've heard bad stories, but frankly, it's happening, right? And the same with shared mobility, with car shares, right? People are like, I don't know who the person was who was in that seat before me. Like, am I totally comfortable with this? And then over time, we start to normalize things that seem really weird and far-fetched at the beginning. So how do we start to embrace this need for innovation and experimentation and just exposing ourselves to different possibility spaces in our region, expose ourselves to trying to bike and saying, wow, okay, if it's a separated bike lane, I'm actually quite comfortable. Like all ages and abilities, possibilities for that. So that's some of what comes to my mind when we talk about both the needs and the benefits, but that they might not always be, it's not a straight line, right? Like sometimes, like the Lime bikes or whatever, they're overarchingly an awesome idea, and then maybe it's still a couple of growing pains, and that's the period we're in, is that we have to be quite embracing of that. We might get some experiments right, wrong, and then we have to correct course. But can you think of some examples of things that you're experimenting with at TransLink that are, the seeds of what we need going forward?
Yeah, no, you totally hit it on the head, right? We need to like go boldly into this new mobility future, and we have a new mobility team at TransLink. So like the bike sharing, electric bikes are a game changer. Governments around the world are looking at them to increase mobility for everyone. You can bring cargo in them. I take my kids to daycare in an electric cargo bike, so they're great, but it also includes a whole typology of different devices that are kind of new and emerging, and some of them may not work, some of them will. The business models are quite challenging, right? And at TransLink, we describe something called the ACEs. Automated, connected, electrified, and shared. These are the 4 trends that are reshaping transportation. And we're seeing autonomous vehicles emerging around the world. They're actually in commercial service in places like San Francisco and Florida and Pittsburgh. These are something that we need to get ahead from a regulatory perspective, and there's a number of concerns. We call it the promise and the peril. The promise is amazing, right? That you won't have to own a car, that you can have on-demand mobility. The challenge is if we have all these cars running around and they're empty, you're going to add to congestion. So let's think about the city we want, and we'll shape the technology in service of the city that we want, right? So.
Thanks, Keane. Charles, did you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, on cars, I think the ecological part is very important and is what's focused on a lot. I think other aspects of car use that, may be forgotten, especially with the talk of electric vehicles, is other effects it has. For one, it takes up a lot of space on the roads. It takes up a lot of infrastructure, the cost to maintain all that. There's public safety concerns, with the speed of cars, especially around schools. There is, equity concerns, right? What if a household can't afford a car, and you need a car to get a job? What does that mean for that household? Or someone who doesn't drive for various reasons. Perhaps they have a disability or can't get a license. But with all this, I think it's also important to recognize that the car is oftentimes the only feasible way of getting around for a lot of people. If the bus only comes every hour, it's very hard to live your life relying on the bus. Or if you live on a hill, biking is very difficult. And so I think changes need to take into account all the needs that people have, and all the requirements of different organizations, and have a conversation to move forward.
Thank you. Final comment on that?
I'll just add to it to say that it brings us back to access, right? Access versus mobility. So to your point, Charles, if the only way to get somewhere is by car, then we also need to ask, what are we trying to achieve by getting somewhere? So some jobs absolutely require us to be able to travel, right? Like we can all think of many where that is the case. But there's been, since the pandemic, as we all know, there's been a huge shift towards remote work. There's a big movement in the work that I do around a 4-day work week. Can we work from home 1 or 2 days a week for some jobs? Can we reduce the need to actually travel, and to what end? What are the ways in which we do that? So these are some of the big societal experiments that we need to play out, and also identify what those benefits are from doing that.
So I just want to tag on something you said. You used the term experiment a couple of times. And I think there's a social response to this, that people don't get, when you try something that doesn't work, you don't get nailed with it. Amy Edmondson, who she's written a lot about psychological safety, and her most recent book is called The Right Way to Be Wrong. And how do you make, have an intelligent failure where you try it and you learn from it, and you don't chastise the people that tried it with good intent, so that they stop experimenting and other people get the same idea. It's got to be a success, because we grow through continuing to get better at the intelligent failures that we make. Okay, I'm going to ask you one last question, then I'm going to turn things into the breakout room, and that's about the challenges or the myths that you're facing in what you're doing. So, Charles, with respect to housing and affordability, what are the big challenges that you see, or what are some of the myths that are out there that perhaps need to be overturned?
Yeah, so this point is maybe a little controversial. But one thing that I think is a myth is that housing supply alone will give us housing affordability. That if we just build more, then prices will come down. If it's the basic supply and demand theory, this concept, but that's not how it actually works. Anyways, without getting into all the details, but with our financial systems, our fiscal systems, just when you just build, oftentimes it's very unaffordable, and you have to build in affordability from the outset in order for those units to be affordable. So, for example, Whistler actually has a very interesting housing program where, on publicly owned land, they build housing, and they limit it to people who work in the community, or who have worked there, but retired, and who don't own property anywhere else in the world. But by building that in right from the start, there's a limited number of people who qualify, and so you don't get these astronomical prices. Anyways, I guess I shouldn't get into too much detail, but yeah, it becomes, if you don't have those limits, people, there are a lot of people who are after housing as investment. Because with the increasing housing prices, and the super low property taxes, compared, as a percentage of the property value, they become, good, or as good as stocks, and so people are buying them, and then with their money buying even more, and it rolls, and so you just have so much money going into these units. Sorry, going on a little bit. But that's the myth that housing supply needs to come with restrictions in order to be affordable. That's I think how it actually works.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Charles. Keane, what are some of the challenges? What opposition do you face in trying to move towards 2050?
Right now, I think we've got a good coalition of the willing in terms of building the strategies, right? Like this 10-year priorities is endorsed by the Mayor's Council. Assuming all of you live in Metro Vancouver, your representative voted for this, and we want to get it built. I think some of the challenge like funding is always going to be a challenge, right? Government has many demands, and we need to think about how we fund transportation. There's a lot of needs out there, and so we're working with our senior government partners and like with the Mayor's Council to figure out where do we get the investment capital to fund this plan. right? And so that, I think that's our main challenge, and we're looking to the future, and we know to solve some of these problems, we have to make that happen. Getting down to the local level, I mean, it's, you know, we're bringing, you know, new rapid transit lines to different parts of the community, and for the most part that's wanted. And I think there's some trade-offs, obviously, right? Because it doesn't matter what the status quo comes with costs, right? When you look at the current system, it's high cost, high carbon, safety issues, and so, you know, the same can be applied to everything that we want to build. When we're thinking about SkyTrain, we love SkyTrain, it's wonderful. It's also very expensive and very slow to deploy. So bus rapid transit, the magic elixir of that is you're putting a bus lane in, right? It's traffic separated so it can go congestion free, which means fast, frequent, high capacity. You can build it quickly and relatively cheaply, but again, you have to change how we use the roads. And you know, different stakeholders have different interests in those roads because we ask a lot of them, right? There's a lot of different uses for the roads and thoroughfares, and so, you know, we just have to be wide-eyed about the trade-offs and think about the best use for all of the resources that we have.
Great, thanks, Keane. I'm going to close off with you, Dagmar, and that's, you know, what's some misinformation or misunderstanding that you think would be helpful to resolve? Like lately I've heard conspiracy theories around the 15-minute city, right? And so...
Yeah, okay. Let me see where I take that. So let me just start with the 15-minute city. So some of that conspiracy theory that you speak about is also like just, you know, not knowing what it refers to. So there was a little bit of a conspiracy that a 15-minute city meant that you were actually going to be kind of tethered to this one area that was within 15 minutes of where you were. Whereas, you know, what I was speaking about earlier, like that idea of a 15-minute city, and in Paris, they call it something different. In Buenos Aires, they call it a human scale city. Portland, it's complete neighborhoods. It's really this idea of having residential with retail businesses and sort of your basic needs kind of being within a walk or a roll or a bike ride sort of from where you live. And that is a pretty enticing concept. But again, these misunderstandings, when you get these kind of catch slogans, they can travel pretty quickly. I guess some other misunderstandings that I was thinking about as we were just listening was, you know, that it's always going to be worse if we move away from personal car ownership. And I think my first opening comments were about all of what we gain, these benefits, right, from our car. You know, this personal space, this, you know, all these things that we can do more quickly. But I think that, you know, in Europe, a huge uptake of overnight trains. Like they're really rebuilding that overnight train network, and people are finding that's really excellent. You know, like it's actually a great way to get around. And the work that we've done with One Earth Living around motivations and insight, sort of some insights research around that, says that we don't need to lead from carbon, right? Like as planners, for example, we need to know that that's actually one of our bottom lines of why we're doing this, but it can be health that appeals to people, that gets them out on their bikes. It can be all kinds of other things that are that. So I guess the other point I was going to say is that we also talk about it as like people are trying to, in Holland they call it autopesten, you know, like congestion charge, like people are getting us out of our cars and they're taking away my right to be in my car. And I think that's a real all or nothing debate that we try to get away from, and that I think that the conversation is so much more mature here in the region. But, you know, it's not all or nothing. It's about having a modal split, a modal share, that you're really picking the best thing for the services you are seeking, for the access to what you're seeking. And that's critical. So I think getting away from that all or nothing, black or white kind of conversation really helps us unlock possibilities.
Great, thank you. Now we're about to get into breakouts but could we first have a hand for these folks, these panelists, what they provide us with?
The question is, we use Lionsgate Bridge only as an example. It's extremely difficult to get downtown, and to go from North Van to West Van after 3 in the afternoon is impossible. But the question is, how do we balance population growth, housing growth, with infrastructure growth, so the mobility actually gets better versus worse? A lot of traffic in West Van drive through other communities that are probably gridlock through here. And so how do we balance?
Basically, you're asking, you know, in a growing region with limited like bridge space, how do we accommodate all this extra growth and traffic? And the answer is to move to more efficient transportation, right? And when you compare, you know, a single occupant vehicle to a bikeway or a sidewalk or a bus in a dedicated lane, you can carry 10 times as many people per, you know, given unit of space using these other modes. So thinking about the Lionsgate Bridge, I think I've done the calculation before. You can put 1,000 cars on it bumper to bumper. The same number of buses, it would take 20 buses, could fit that number of people. So what that means is for us, TransLink, or to alleviate the major congestion issues that you have on the North Shore, it's thinking about how do we bring rapid transit here as quickly as possible. And so that's that BRT, Bus Rapid Transit. That's a bus in its own separated lane, signal priority, fast, frequent, high capacity with nice stations, really nice vehicles. That's free from congestion. You can fit more people on it. And you know, that's something that we need to think about doing to help alleviate that problem. You know, we're looking at the second narrows kind of part to run that. And you know, just generally, cars are very space inefficient. So the more that we can shift people away from the cars, the more that we can do to alleviate congestion problems.
This is an interesting one because of all the controversy that we had here in West Van when there was a suggestion, I think, by TransLink to put a B line, which was west of Park Royal. So the question that came from our group is, what is TransLink's transportation plan for west of Park Royal? You mentioned transportation hubs would be in Park Royal. What about people and the rest of us that live west?
We've got Transport 2050 is the 30-year plan, and we're parceling it out into like 3 chunks, decade by decade. The 10-year priorities, or access for everyone, that's what we're going to do in the next 10 years. You're right that bus rapid transit and rapid bus are being planned to Park Royal, and there's a prioritization process underway in the region because there's a lot of corridors that need the work, and we can only do, you know, a few at a time. What comes west? I'm not entirely sure what the answer is. I know part of T2050 10-year priorities is a double bus service over 10 years, and I don't know exactly how that parses out in West Vancouver, west of Park Royal, but I think you can assume, you know, if we're increasing bus service by 130%, some of those benefits are going to roll. I just don't think that we're there yet with the granular plans. That's the bus side of the equation. We are trying to build a major bikeway network, right? There's gaps around the region, and you know, talking about the Spirit Trail, connecting that and like making it awesome, coming up through up to Horseshoe Bay and Lions Bay. That's another priority of ours as well.
Wondering how you can learn from the experience what happened with the B-line, and have there been similar instances like this around the world to bring those learnings back to West Vancouver? Do you have the gumption to come back to West Vancouver?
We're looking around the world for solutions that work. When we're building our bus rapid transit plan, we interviewed all the successful cities in North America, asking them, what's the magical elixir, right? And the challenge is there's not a silver bullet, right? Every jurisdiction has its own context, their own tactics that have worked, or you know, the policies and the way that they've engineered it. And I think you know, having a dialogue with the community and talking about what they want to see in that street space to ensure that as we're changing the street, it can accommodate all users, which, you know, yes, maybe we need to redeploy some of that space away from parking or general purpose traffic, but we're thinking about improving it for everyone. So that's the bus rapid transit, but since we're engineering it too, it's thinking about how can we improve the sidewalks, right? How can we improve the shelters? How can we change the street architecture so that those local businesses there are going to thrive? You know, you're going to have a lot of turnover. Buses bring a lot of people, which means a lot of business, right? So there's, you know, measuring like the turnover at parking spots is an amazing thing that other cities have done because, you know, a single parking meter, a car is potentially going to park there for 3 or 4 hours. That's one person. If you can bring more people in, it's more business. So it's looking at the analytics behind that and, you know, using that to convince the BIAs and the merchants. But again, reframing it is, we're changing the street. How can we design this better? Get everyone involved. design charrettes, engagement. It's not going to be easy, but I think that there's some tested ways from other places that we can learn from.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, my observation, I've been in West Van for almost 30 years, and that it's really hard to get enough people engaged in the conversation early when things are being developed. But they'll come out in droves once something has been printed up that they disagree with. And I think that's a challenge throughout, getting people to contribute, because a lot of times a few strong voices outweigh the thousands of voices that you never hear. So I think part of that is important as well. Okay.
How do we motivate West Vancouver residents and council to proactively deal with transportation, density, and other related issues that it hasn't dealt with for many years?
No, that's a great question. So how do you get more people engaged in this kind of topic area so that the voices come out earlier? And you know, I think part of it is like going back to kind of demystifying that process. And so that's something that we can do as neighbors with each other, is to really just make people aware of that. I certainly know lots of friends who have never spoken at a public meeting before. So I think there's a piece of just sort of awareness around how to do that effectively, and that's even a channel that we have. We tend to complain to each other at a party instead. And so that's one piece of it. The other piece is coming in with something that people care about. So really it's that framing piece. And so sometimes showing the linkages between what they care about. Maybe it's caring about their local community and the thriving of the businesses that are there, and seeing the mom and pop stores close. And so they're interested in that kind of piece of it. And then if you're someone who is with positive voices, or like a proponent of looking at some of these bigger questions, then it's like, how do you link those two questions together? So it's making that link and bringing them in the door with something that they care about.
Keane, you want to jump in on that as well?
Yeah, building off that, 2 points. Never underestimate the power of a very small determined group. I'm referencing as well, maybe on the other side of the coin, there's been some daycare projects in Metro Vancouver. We're in a daycare crisis, right? And very reasonable projects have been shot down because of, you know, a small number of people who advocate at council, and, you know, they have reasons, legitimate reasons, but I think that just goes to show you that, you know, a small number of people can have a major influence. But I also think we need to reform public participation in the municipal context. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Dave Meslin. Center for Dialogue is doing some work on reforming public hearings, because the fact of the matter is they're not very inclusive, right? Those development placards, they're not very accessible. The times and when hearings are, it's, you know, people have to go to work, or they have kids, or they can't afford daycare or childcare to come to that meeting, or they have to wait on speaking lists for hours. And so, you know, thinking big about how we change this is, you know, it's not going to be easy, but I think that's a missing ingredient.
My question is, the funding of TransLink, you would think, if I look at all these high rises in Oakridge and further down in Canby, you would think that the upzone, if a portion that doesn't go to the developer only, that also goes to TransLink itself. And your Arbutus stop is another example where there is a lot of development going on at the Arbutus stop of the Broadway extension. Can you shed some light on how that money is being generated, used, and can we eventually see free public transit?
So I think you're asking about capturing land value capture and using that to fund transit, which is, I don't think I mean, actually that's probably a better question for Charles, land use expert over here.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate of that. You know, when a SkyTrain line goes in, you know, there are different studies being done, but, you know, people say that it's the rezoning that increases the value, but the transit enables the rezoning, right? So you could say, you know, the transit contributed to the value. And yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense, but, you know, in conversations with others, I think something that, you know, impedes that is that whenever this is talked about in the public of transit TransLink taking some of that increase, people talk about housing affordability. They think that this charge would make housing more expensive. So I think it really depends on how the policy is implemented. If the municipality charges enough for the extra density, I think it wouldn't necessarily impact prices. Some people say that that it would impact supply, but again, supply isn't having less supply wouldn't necessarily impact affordability. And so yeah, I think it's a very fruitful avenue to explore, but given that transit involves so many different parties, the federal government, the provincial government, municipalities, citizens, I really think it needs a dialogue. Like, we need to bring all these parties together and talk about how can we fund transit, especially with the land uplift through rezoning. Yeah.
We talk about all these ideas in the ether, and this is my concern because I've worked most of my career restructuring companies, and you have to solve one problem at a time. And my problem or my concern tonight is what I've heard is we're going to solve equity, greenhouse gases, homelessness, drug use, car use. What is our order of operation? Because we can't solve for 100 things at one time.
Okay.
What are we going to solve for? Say in the next 2 to 3 years.
I think the most important societal issue to solve in Greater Vancouver right now is housing affordability. I think it contributes to the transportation problem, because with the high housing prices, people are forced to live further away and then have to commute really far, and so they're really linked. But then I think behind housing affordability problems is a governance problem. It's that the problems we're dealing with, the authority to do things are divided among so many different entities that it's very hard to do anything. Or to act together to solve a problem. And so I think having to repeat again, having all these players come together and talk through everyone's needs and concerns and come to a solution everyone can agree with. I think that's the sort of operation we need to get at before addressing all these issues.
Okay, and your 1 minute response?
Yeah, no, you raise a zinger, right? Because in a way, the positive framing of it would be, what are the co-benefits we're solving for, right? Like, what are the co-benefits we're getting here? And but then what's the kernel, right? And so I would say from one perspective, and I'm not going to give you just one answer, I'm going to say from one perspective, we're on a finite planet. Like, there actually is an ecological necessity to us resolving this. So I would say that for me is one of the primary things, but I don't see that as at odds of rebuilding communities that we want to live in that are more connected. I think those two, like our well-being and the other one, are the two to be solved for. And then along with that are all kinds of tactical questions that we need to resolve as we go on.
Great, thank you. Keane.
So what you're describing in government policy circles is called a polycrisis, of which our country and region is experiencing. And I mean, might construe this as being naive, but I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And when I think about like a sustainable, equitable city, building it right, you can tackle affordability, you can tackle emissions, you can tackle social problems, and that's really, mixed use communities, homes for everybody served by transit, walking, biking, and rolling, and shifting our mobility to zero emissions. Maybe that's a simplistic view, but I mean, if we can kind of build the cities that we want, I think that you can solve multiple problems with that sort of sustainable city vision.
So let me ask you a question without putting you on the spot. When we're done, if any of you are happy to stay around, there may be some other people who have conversations with you, but no pressure. I'd actually say that one of the priorities that I see as an outsider is figuring out a way to get the right people together around the right cause at the right time, because that seems to be a problem for so many things.
Speaking of culture change, you were talking about culture change.
Yeah,
And I wondered how many people
we wondered how many people here know someone trapped in a house on the hill here in West Van, with steep roads. Maybe they're no longer able to walk that well up and down those hills with no sidewalks. I wondered if you would ask the room that. And as a follow-up question, if you thought, do you think if they could see it to be better, if they didn't believe that that big house on the hill was the pinnacle of their achievement in life, do you think their life would be better if they lived in maybe a smaller space with some elevators and be able to walk to people nearby?
So I'm happy to take your challenge and just say, who here feels like they don't have the transportation options that they need to be able to age in place, for example, or to stay where they are? Like who feels like there are some pieces that they need to advocate for or need to better understand? Yeah, that you're not quite like feeling like it's working for you, that there aren't really a lot of options outside of maybe a personal vehicle. Mm-hmm. Right. So some of that is a question of and then you've raised two subsequent questions, which are first of all, are there mobility options, multi-mobility options that can help in that situation? Maybe we haven't really learned enough about, maybe we don't know what those are. Maybe we need to find out. And then the other one is, are there other alternatives to the location that we're living in? Did it serve us very well for a period of time? And are there periods at which maybe a different living situation works? And I don't think we ask those questions enough because, again, to the cultural question, it's tied up in prestige, it's tied up in our lives, it's tied up in what we've built up together. We don't normalize that. In a lot of cultures, it's super normalized that over the course of one's life, one has very different kind of living situations and moves around, and that is less a discussion. And so I think, I'm just leaving it to say that I would agree with you that these are really important conversations we need to have as a community, especially in a housing crisis.
Okay,
and they're interesting ones, right? What are the different solutions that are out there?
Our question, and I think the best way maybe to put it, and this is maybe a good way to end, is from each one of you, I want one concrete suggestion that we can do as individuals when we go home tonight or this week that will make a difference and that is going to help this overall cause.
Great question to close off with.
We talked about all these places with these case studies of good practices. But how do we apply it here? I think one really practical thing to do is in West Van, in all of the municipalities here, there's so much land here that is owned by public entities or by nonprofits. I think this property might be, right? Nonprofit? Yeah, so all these pieces of land have so much, there's so much space up top, and we say that, money doesn't grow on trees, but, in a sense, money falls from the sky. All this space is worth a lot of money, and it could solve so much problems if we develop that for affordable housing or for market housing that and we charge money for that and spend it on transit or other things. And so I guess coming down to the citizen level, perhaps it would be to write your district council in support of such a notion that we want our municipal owned land to be redeveloped for affordable housing and other housing that supports transit and active transportation.
That's great. Thanks, Charles. That's very practical. Okay.
Yeah, okay. It's a really great question of what can we do the next day. And I'm going to cheat a little bit by building on your point, Charles, and saying that I think there's a big advocacy piece in this. So that same motivations research I mentioned was done across all of British Columbia. And one of the questions that we asked was, do you now advocate for better transportation options where I live? Are you open to it, or are you kind of less or disinterested? And so what we found was that a segment called Healthy Life and Planet, which was kind of our systems thinkers in a way, were the folks that were saying they're doing it now. and everybody else with either less or disinterested or convincible on it. But when you added those two together, it was just 22% said they're doing it now, and you get 61% when you add the other three segments, which were a lot more pro-social, who were interested in advocating. So I would say, I'll go back to that question of speaking to your neighbor, but then also being the change you seek, right? So really taking a look at the ways in which you're exploring, modeling different ways of being in your community, whether it's speaking to your neighbors, creating a shared space, creating more public luxury, advocating for that, because with that come different transportation options, different other pieces.
Okay, and closing us off, Keane, over to you.
Well, thanks everyone for sticking in. It's late, and appreciate being here. So I'm going to take a page out of the great economist Mark Jacquard's book, The Citizen Guide to Climate Success, which you can download for free as a PDF if you don't want a physical copy. And it basically boils down to support leaders who are making the change you want. And if you don't see those leaders, become one yourself, right? So vote, write letters to your editor, talk to your neighbors.